public and work from a basis of facts rather than conjecture or mistruths that you may hear. So there's a lot in that question. I was trying to pay attention. I may work backwards on that. I guess first I'll say something about Secretary Powell. Obviously, he's from a different generation than I am. It is true, I was probably in the room a few times with him, always in awe or with great respect. So his passing, of course, is a great loss for the country. He was a towering figure for decades. In particular in the national security area, but his appeal and his accomplishments and the model he set were really important for the whole society. He was a role model, I can tell you, for people working in government in my generation, and just somebody who earned and deserved enormous respect. We may talk a little bit about the aspect of his life story, his obituary that people are focusing on now, and that was the presentation he made to the UN Security Council in the early days of 2003, justifying the invasion of Iraq and removal of Saddam Hussein. But anyway, that was premised on, of course, the presence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq that we later found out were not there. I can assure you, everybody in the intelligence community who had anything to do with that process, we regret deeply not just that Secretary Powell was put in that position, but rather the President Bush himself was ill-served. I'll quote a friend and a great American, General Mike Hayden, who was our CIA director and NSA director a few years back. He referred to the Iraq WMD assessment as a clean swing and a miss, right? For those of you who are baseball fans, there was a lot of that assessment that simply turned out to be wrong. There's a lot of poor intelligence tradecraft, and the best that can be said was our community, the intelligence community, didn't serve the President or Secretary Powell particularly well on that assessment, and all of us regret it deeply. We did not miss out on the opportunity to waste a good crisis. We actually learned a lot from it, corrected a lot of what made those assessments flawed, and I think we're in a better position to make future assessments of unconventional weapons programs in distant, closed societies, but time will tell on that.
And I suppose, you know, the 9/11 Commission, the different reports mentioned on WMD track, a lot of, you know, great intensive study at all aspects of the United States government. Within the intelligence community, what are some of the biggest lessons and the ways it changed how you all operated? You know, not being siloed so much anymore, kind of thinking things differently. I think a lot of Americans forget, you know, like I've said before, if you told me on September 12th, 2001, there'd be no major terrorist attack in the United States for 20 years, I'd say, well, yeah, that sounds nice, but I don't expect it. But we have had 20 years of relatively minor terrorist attacks in the United States. How and why and how was the intelligence community kind of reshaped?
Okay, thanks. Again, sorry to bounce around, but I neglected to say one thing. I will answer that. I neglected to say one thing about Secretary Powell. He wasn't an intelligence officer at any time. He obviously held a number of prominent posts, National Security Advisor, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and later the Secretary of State, of course. But even though he wasn't an intelligence officer, I want to assure you that he comes up in our intelligence classes literally every semester that we teach at the University of Texas. And that's in his role as an intelligence consumer. So when I thought of his passing, I thought immediately of this lesson that we use literally every semester when we're teaching undergraduates about the role U.S. intelligence plays in our national security and our policy-making process. And we always cite Colin Powell as maybe the most sophisticated and savvy consumer of intelligence. So we all know what intelligence is, right? It's that information that we gather from around the world, we evaluate it and make sense of it, and we present it to policymakers to help them make the hard decisions that they were elected to make. And Colin Powell was a great consumer of intelligence. And a former boss of mine, who later became the deputy director at CIA, often tells the story of briefing Secretary Powell. I think when he was the National Security Advisor in the Reagan administration. He said, Secretary Powell sat him down and said, so here's what I expect from you, as my intelligence briefer. He said, I want you to tell me clearly what you know. Then I want you to tell me what you don't know. Then I want you to tell me what you think. And I don't want you ever to confuse those three. Right? Which I think is about the most sophisticated, intelligent way to be a good intelligence customer that I can imagine. It's a good lesson for any customer, and he was one of the best. Now, to the subject of intelligence failure, which seems to be a word that's almost hyphenated these days, can't say one without the other. First to 9/11. So we did just recently we commemorated the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks on New York and Washington, D.C. And those were, by any measure, an intelligence failure because our intelligence community failed to adequately warn the President of the United States, at least in sufficient detail, that these attacks were being planned, would be executed in the United States, and might involve turning aircraft into missiles, or that they would target the symbols of American democracy and American financial strength in New York and Washington, D.C. Certainly the U.S. intelligence community knew something was up. As the Director of Central Intelligence, George Tenet, told the Commission after the fact, he said, our system was blinking red, right, in the summer of 2001. We knew something was up. We knew Al-Qaeda had a plot underway. We weren't sure if it was going to be executed abroad or in the United States, but we were surprised. And when the nation is surprised, and thousands of lives are lost, and our economy is dramatically disrupted, our Western alliances are thrown into turmoil, that's an intelligence failure, because our intelligence community is well-resourced, is globally deployed, skilled and highly capable, and they failed to warn the President of the United States of that attack. So, what happens after that? Of course, the U.S. government responds immediately. President Bush shows what, in my view, was incredibly strong leadership. The U.S. intelligence community transformed its activities. Immediately, counterterrorism activities became our worldwide priority mission. They were a prominent mission. Before that, they became almost an exclusive, a monopolistic obsession for the U.S. intelligence community for the next 20 years. And as Ronan said, I think on balance, I have to say I was troubled a bit with the commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks being sort of simultaneously mixed up with the very messy, poorly executed withdrawal of the U.S. forces from Afghanistan. Those were different events. And if you want to hear it, I'll share a view on the withdrawal from Afghanistan. But it's very different and not fair to say that 20-year occupation was money and lives, treasure, national prestige, misspent, nothing was accomplished, lives wasted. That's simply not the case. Because as you said, Ronan, for 20 years after the 9/11 attacks, when we immediately assessed that there would be second, third, follow-on waves of attacks planned by Al-Qaeda, and they were planned by Al-Qaeda, but they weren't executed because your government, diplomats, intelligence officers, soldiers, airmen, and Marines all reacted with great alacrity, right? And a global war on terrorism was launched, and we can talk about some of the components of that. Some of them are controversial, particularly some of the intelligence activities. But the fact of the matter is America didn't suffer a second catastrophic attack. And credit for that goes to at least 3 successive presidents, and also in part to the U.S. intelligence community. So there was nonetheless a failure that started this. There was strong intelligence work, a good national response afterwards that prevented a second catastrophic attack. But revelation led to a new law, the law that Tatiana referred to, the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, 2004. So we restructured U.S. intelligence in response to the failure to warn, to detect and disrupt the 9/11 attacks. We did a couple of things you'll recognize. We created a director of national intelligence, a new leader of the intelligence community who would integrate these now 18 different agencies more closely together, allow them to unify and work not redundantly, but rather in cooperation with one another. So that was the first big step. We also created a National Counterterrorism Center, part of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which was a single place where all the threats, all the terrorist threat reporting that the U.S. government had access to from around the world would be gathered in one place, and the President of the United States could go for a single assessment about what he should be concerned about, how serious threats were, what threats were looming on the horizon, which ones were real today, right? And so those institutions now exist. They're frankly now 15, 16 years old, and some of us are starting to take stock, particularly some of us who are involved in designing and passing the law that created them. We're anxious to see if they're working, if they're having the desired impact. And I'll just leave it with, that's a mixed grade. I think we do have new institutions. They're occupied by good people. They're doing their best to integrate what is a massive, massive enterprise. I could throw it open for questions, but it's a little early for that. Does anybody in here know how much money American taxpayers spend on U.S. intelligence in a year? Does $80 billion sound like the right amount? You should, just for comparison's sake, you should look at the gross domestic product of countries in the European Union and see where the U.S. intelligence community would rank if it were an independent country. It's a lot of money. 18 different agencies, well over 100,000 full-time staff employees, global presence. So this is a huge enterprise. It needs unified, integrating leadership, and that's what we created the DNI to do. The NCTC, I think, is a great success. They deserve a great amount of credit for the fact that we haven't had a second attack. We've detected and disrupted literally hundreds of attacks against Americans, American interests, allies, and our homeland. And so they deserve a lot of credit. So I can be critical, but I won't, about some of the fine points in the IRTPA, the Intelligence Reform Law. But you should know, from a historical standpoint, that we suffered an unwarranted attack. It was an intelligence failure. We recognized it as that. Under President Bush's leadership, we corrected that by accepting the recommendations of a very serious and thoughtful commission, passing a new law, and restructuring this massive intelligence community. Now, there's a future beyond that, but that's the matter of it.
And related to that, ideally, and there are real people involved, and emotions and the stress of what's going on, especially after 9/11, can affect people from the highest levels of administration to people, we're operating on the ground around the world, like you did some of your years of clandestine service. But at its core, the most effective intelligence community of the United States will have three basic tasks. I mean, very important but essential tasks. It's intelligence collection, intelligence analysis, and a covert action when the administration says act upon this intelligence in a certain manner. When we think about Iraq and their, again, I don't want to get into the background of what went on, but do you think it's fair to say that in some ways, and some of that was from pressure coming from the highest levels of administration perhaps, that intelligence was being, even if unconsciously, being used to support a position rather than to inform a decision? And beyond that, do you think we've gotten to a point now where we've created a better firewall between intelligence providing the best information and analysis they can, as opposed to perhaps leaning into policy?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. That's this issue is for intelligence professionals and teachers, like I am these days. This is called politicization, and it's a huge problem. It's a huge risk for intelligence agencies here in the United States and the allies, even our adversary states. And it's the issue of getting intelligence to policymakers that is fact-based, that is neutral, that is nonpartisan, that is objective, that is non-policy prescriptive. In other words, what Sherman Kent, the legendary founder of CIA's estimative intelligence organization, referred to as the straight dope. Right? That's what policymakers in the United States are entitled to, and that's what they expect to receive for their $80 billion and their 18 agencies and their worldwide risks that we undertake to gather this information. They expect straightforward analysis. that neither supports their policy nor unnecessarily criticizes their policy nor distracts them what they're trying to do, but are just the facts. To quote Dragnet, for those of you of a certain age, right? And so that's politicization. And on the question of politicization, I do have a strong view. It's not shared by everybody, but politicization was not the problem. It was not the reason the U.S. intelligence community generated a national intelligence estimate in the fall of 2002 that included assessments that were simply wrong. That Saddam was X number of months from acquiring a nuclear weapon, that Saddam Hussein had stockpiles of chemical weapons, that Saddam Hussein had mobile biological weapons labs that he could use in wartime to create banned biological weapons. These assessments were simply wrong on their own merit. As I said, straight swing and a miss. The analysts were not trying to give the White House a reason to go to war in Iraq or to give Secretary Powell a persuasive speech to deliver at the UN Security Council. We simply had a failure of collection, which you described as the first mission of U.S. intelligence, go out there and get the information we need to keep the country safe. We didn't know enough about these unconventional weapons programs to make reliable assessments. And among other things, we should have been much more clear about that in the documents that we prepared or in the speech that we helped Secretary Powell prepare and present. It was also an analytic failure. This is, I hate the term, but it will get you in the right neighborhood, connecting the dots. This is making sense of incomplete, possibly confusing, often contradictory information and figuring out what does this mean? And what does it mean for the United States? And explaining that to the president and other people who have important responsibilities and decisions to make. So we failed in not collecting enough information about Saddam's unconventional work. We didn't have the sources we should have had. We didn't have the deep penetrations of his government and his inner circle. We also failed to assess the information we did have accurately. We reached judgments that were not adequately supported by the facts that we had. We should have been more modest, much more humble. These are called confidence judgments, and you will have read about them in the newspapers when the intelligence community says, we think this is going to happen, this is probably going to happen. We have low confidence in that judgment, but we have high confidence in that judgment. U.S. policymakers in 2002 should have been told that we had low confidence in most of these judgments, but that's not the rating that was sent downtown with them. So, I won't go into covert action because that all hasn't been laid bare even from the Iraq days, but we failed at collection, we failed at analysis, and it's deeply disappointing to everybody in U.S. intelligence that was part of it. We did, though, learn from it. We had an independent commission appointed by the president, the Silverman-Robb Commission, and they did a great report and sent recommendations to the White House that President Bush largely accepted and implemented. And the CIA and the intelligence community itself did their own investigations and said, what did we do wrong here? What can we fix? How can we prevent this from happening in the future? And they were wrenching self-examinations of our intelligence agencies, and they had an impact. We do counterproliferation intelligence in particular much different today.
And, obviously, you mentioned, 20 years ago, the world was a different place. We had an enormous shift to a counterterrorism emphasis for the intelligence community, our military, those in the State Department, everyone related to our foreign policy. But back then, also perhaps benefit by the fact that Russia was, relatively speaking, much weaker, less involved. China obviously was a rising power, but not nearly the strength and the wealth and the military power that it is now. How did that shift to counterterrorism emphasis for intelligence community impact, or did it impact the massive needs that we've had in the few years and the many years going forward for an incredibly dynamic and diverse and challenging mission of handling Russia, handling China, North Korea, proliferations, cyber threats, and how is it very different to go from intelligence community trying to track individual terrorists and groups to trying to combat the Russians and the Chinese, who are excellent in their own with regards to espionage and spying and counterintelligence. What's that big shift like?
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for that. This is the issue of priorities. Although, as I've explained several times, the U.S. intelligence community has been blessed with enormous resources, globally deployed resources. So they have good people, they have money, we have exotic technology that helps us uncover facts overseas, but it's never enough. Because there are always going to be more questions than you have answers to. You're always going to want more money, more people, and more authority if you're in the executive branch of government. Now, our system's fairly interesting in this regard. This is not a discussion of comparative intelligence services. We're going to talk largely about the American intelligence community. But ours is different from most other countries in this respect, in that the intelligence priorities don't come from the intelligence community themselves. Many countries in the world, including our principal adversaries or peer competitors, if you want to use the new jargon for Russia and China, the intelligence professionals themselves are expected to tell the political leaders what they should be worrying about. Sir, we think this is the biggest problem, this is the next most disconcerting problem, and you ought to watch this guy and watch that space and worry about this. So they count on their security professionals to warn them and tell them what they ought to be thinking about. Ours is very much a secret intelligence organization that works in a democracy, in an open society, ruled by consent, elected leadership. So we have a system that works exactly the opposite. The policymakers are expected, since they're in touch with the people, they ran for office, won elections, earned the people's mandate to lead the country. So we expect our policymakers to tell the intelligence community what they should be worried about. This is what we want you to be collecting. This is the analysis we expect you to produce. And these are the covert action activities that we would like you to undertake. And that makes sense for those of us who are attracted to our form of government, where the power ultimately derives from the people through our delegates and our representatives in Washington. And so in our system, they're the ones who set the priorities. All that to say, on 9/11, when we were attacked by radical Islamists, as I say, symbols of our wealth and our world leadership, were attacked, there was no debate about what the U.S. intelligence community, what the military, what our financial system, what everybody should be worried about. We were all in the counterterrorism business, and we've remained in that business essentially for 2 decades, and I would argue with some success. Many lives saved, many plots disrupted. Many lives also lost, and many resources invested. So this was not a free win. Anyway, we now have 20 years into the war on terrorism, to coin President Bush's term. There's now a general consensus emerging in Washington from the policy leaders, from the political leadership. It's bipartisan. Both parties. It's shared in the executive branch with the legislative branch, along with the academy, the universities and think tanks, the ideas industry in the United States. Everybody agrees that it's time to take some of the emphasis, some of the focus, some of the resources away from counterterrorism and direct those towards new threats that we can see on the horizon, that we can anticipate. And those are the peer competitors. I would not include Russia in that list. Russia is a declining power, dangerous but declining. China is the preeminent concern, if not a threat. And so there's a consensus in our national security community, I think frankly across the nation, that China bears closer watching. It's unclear whether they will be an enemy someday or a competitor. Whether there will ever be a military confrontation, where our trade relations will go. But it's inevitably going to be a very complicated relationship. And U.S. policymakers are going to need to understand a great deal more about China in the future than they do today. And that translates to the intelligence community. So Avril Haines, our very competent Director of National Intelligence, first female to hold the post, and I think off to a really strong start. She testified every year, as our intelligence leaders do at the Congress. It's something called the Worldwide Threat Testimony. For those of us who used to prepare our bosses to go testify at it, it was more frequently referred to as the Gong Show, because it's a rare opportunity for people who do most of their work in secret to sit in front of the television cameras, in front of a series of members of Congress, Senate, and House, different committees, and answer questions, most of which were prepared for television, rather than actually soliciting an honest answer. But it's part of an open society and conducting secret intelligence activities within that open society. But when Avril went up to deliver that to the Hill in the spring, which she did, the priorities had all changed. Where every year, literally for 18 years before then, it was counterterrorism, counterterrorism, counterterrorism. It's AQ, it's IS, it's regional terrorist groups, it's domestic terrorism. Well, that shifted. Terrorism dropped, frankly, below 5 or 6. I lost count after a while. And all of a sudden, peer competitors, China at the top, were acknowledged by her as the #1 priority for U.S. intelligence, at least in the coming year. My guess is next year's worldwide threat testimony will look very similar, right? And so now the U.S. intelligence community has the daunting task of transforming structures, resources, personnel systems, foreign platforms, relationships with allies and friends overseas to accomplish a different task. And you don't have to be intelligence experts to understand that an intelligence agency designed to penetrate a closed society, the Central Military Commission, where the leadership resides in China, to determine what China's plans and intentions are, is a different intelligence community from the one that's trying to find Islamic extremists in South Asia or the Maghreb or Southeast Asia trying to plot terrorist attacks in the United States. It goes from finding people to finding fleets and weapons systems and economic trends and leadership plans and intentions from a bunch of people who don't publicize their meetings and don't talk about what their real plans and intentions are. So the intelligence community has an enormous task in front of it, and that's to transform itself. And this is not a lift-in-place operation. This doesn't happen in 48 hours or in 10 months, but hopefully the Congress and outside commentators will all keep the pressure on Avril and the DNI's office that now leads from a prominent position, all 18 agencies. She should be able to steer this ship away from counterterrorism. And so what does that mean? The kinds of people you hire, right? The platforms you create overseas, the stations and bases and forward operating platforms, the relationships you need to find terrorists in South Asia with other countries, with other security services, are very different than the relationships you need in the war on terrorism. You need people who know something about China, or who border China, or who have access on their own to things going on inside China. These will become our new friends and allies. So this is an enormous transformation. It's something you all, as well-informed private citizens, should be following very closely. It's something when you get Representative Crenshaw in here, you should ask him whether he's paying attention to. Because everybody has talked about the pivot to Asia, right? This goes back to the Obama administration. This is not news that America's interests are going to be increasingly found in the Western Pacific rather than in Europe or the Middle East or South Asia, where most of our time and resources have been deployed, right? So, but the question is anybody in government actually turning in that direction? Are forces being redeployed? Are new relationships being built? Are Chinese speakers being hired rather than Pashto speakers or Dari speakers or other languages that were important to success in the Middle East? These are important questions to ask. Much of U.S. intelligence has to be secret to be successful, and you should expect a no comment. There's no reason in the world why members of Congress, leaders of our intelligence agencies, shouldn't be able to tell us how they're transitioning to deal with threats in the Pacific and how they're de-emphasizing and de-resourcing from counterterrorism. If they can't answer that question, we should be concerned.
And to turn where you spent most of your career in the CIA and clandestine services before your years in the White House and other levels at the higher levels of the intelligence community, you were in human intelligence, perhaps maybe the most vital form of intelligence. There's signal intelligence, there's satellite imagery, there's tapping phones and cyber, but that's still an enormously crucial, vital component of intelligence. you worked all over the world. You were even chief of station in 2 countries. For those you know, that's the chief intelligence officer or spy runner, whatever people like to call them in a country for the United States. Coordinate all of our informants. How does just modern technology make it that much harder now for a young case officer or, in the CIA going abroad when, if you go through a retinal scanner at an airport, they scan your retina, they have a picture of you. Doesn't matter what your passport says, they know that. Or facial recognition software or cyber techniques. How much harder is it to actually run human sources now with so many changes in modern technology?
Yeah, that's a great question. Some of my snarky former colleagues, when I was working in the policy area as in President Bush's National Security Council, used to derisively sneer and tell me, "Didn't you used to be a case officer?" Cut to the quick. Yeah, I left a very comfortable, enjoyable law practice in Philadelphia to become a CIA operations officer. We call them case officers. The job is pretty simple. It's spot, assess, develop, and recruit foreigners to spy for the United States to betray their own governments. It gets a lot more complicated and a lot more personal than that. And it's called human intelligence, human in the vernacular of intelligence work. And I guess I want to agree with the first half of your question. Yes, it's really important. You need human intelligence. And the reason is simply because it's the only way you can very often find out, particularly in a closed society, which we increasingly find ourselves working against, right? Whether it's Russia, China, Iran, or Burma, these are not people who conduct their business in public. These are not people who talk to journalists, or at least don't tell them the truth. And so to get their secrets, to understand what their plans and intentions are, right? You need to have human sources inside the government who will tell you, risk their lives, a great risk for themselves to help the United States understand what's going on in their home country. So we're going to need human intelligence. The U.S. intelligence community, if it's known for one thing in global intelligence circles, not that there's a convention each year where people get together, but technical intelligence is frankly what made U.S. intelligence what it is today. If you think back to the Cold War, the tremendous problem we had as our World War II ally became our adversary in this decades-long Cold War, this global competition for influence and power. Well, we had an enemy that spanned however many, 10, 11 time zones and had nuclear weapons, could destroy the United States many times over. And the job of U.S. intelligence was to find those nuclear weapons and find out how strong they were and find out how reliable they were, find out how they were going to be delivered, find out what the command chain looked like from the Kremlin, down to some forest in Siberia where these launchers were found. And the way the United States accomplished that was through technology, the way we solved lots of other problems. CIA, without mentioning other agencies, created the U-2, right? This engineering marvel that flew at tremendous altitude and high speeds and took pictures of places like Cuba, right? And then after that, it was the Oxcart, the SR-71 Blackbird, coolest looking plane ever. There's one hanging on a pole outside CIA headquarters at Langley. Joint project with the U.S. Air Force. It's still a marvel of technology and what it could do. And that gave way, of course, to the Corona satellite program. These were all technology programs designed to image foreign territories from overhead invulnerably, right? Incapable of attacking. You couldn't, at least in the early 1960s, take down a U.S. spy satellite. You didn't have a weapon that reached that high. So anyway, technology and technical intelligence, TechInt, imagery intelligence, signals, intercepts. We have a national security agency that performs in that area. Has always been a tremendous strength of U.S. intelligence. Human intelligence has not been so highly regarded in the United States. We can discuss, and we often do in class, why that is, what makes Americans and U.S. intelligence maybe less capable, less proficient at recruiting and handling spies than some of our adversaries. We can talk about that afterwards, maybe. But the bottom line is it's still necessary, and the challenge that you define is real, and that now technology cuts both ways. So we continue to use our incredible technology to gather information that we need to inform these assessments, to make better policy decisions, right? That's the formula. It's easy to get confused by U.S. intelligence with all the acronyms and all the confusing descriptions. It's a pretty simple case, if you want to think about it that way. We gather better information, we provide it to our policymakers, and we get better decisions that help keep us safer and more prosperous. And if it's working, that's how it's supposed to work. Okay? So we do need intelligence, and now what's the role played by technology? As you described, it's getting harder to be a case officer and work overseas, in the sense that, if any of you understand the camera systems that exist in a place like London or now most major Chinese cities, it's hard to walk around wearing your face and not be detected or not be tracked. Nobody needs to walk around behind you or drive a car behind you. They can simply pass you from camera to camera and know where you are, which makes it very difficult to handle clandestine spies, right? Because you jeopardize their life if you're photographed or seen in the vicinity with them, right? So that makes it difficult. Traveling in aliens' identities. Sometimes I can't travel to a country and be Steve Slick because they know about Steve Slick, or they've had a previous encounter with Steve Slick and they don't really want him in their country, or are going to keep pretty close track of him when he gets to that country, right? So that means maybe I shouldn't be traveling through the airport and having my retina scanned because I've only got one retina. Notwithstanding the movies that you see where people have sort of disposable retinas as they go through this process. So I'll just wrap it up and say technology is a challenge. It's not an insurmountable challenge. We have extremely clever, extremely adaptable intelligence officers. We use tradecraft, sometimes very sophisticated tradecraft, to keep our agents alive and reporting. U.S. intelligence can and is doing that every day. But on balance, I'll tell you that I think technology actually cuts in a different direction. I think technology ultimately is going to be a net gain for U.S. intelligence. And so while it may be more difficult for me to travel using another name to another country, it may be more difficult for me to not be surveilled through a major metropolitan area, given the digital cameras and the coverage that may be involved, or maybe my cell phone is tracking me and they can easily know where I'm at. That all makes my life difficult as a case officer. But the person you don't want to be is the chief of counterintelligence at the FSB in Russia or the MSS in Beijing, responsible for learning the identities and stopping Chinese nationals from spying for the United States or Great Britain or France or any other countries that they view as rivals. Because who that person needs to worry about? Not the 5 or 10 or 3 intelligence officers undercover at the U.S. Embassy. They may be able to monitor them very closely. They need to worry about the tens and tens of thousands of their fellow citizens who have access to secret information and sit at home all night on the internet. And they have to worry about which ones of them are actually punching in secret information, pushing encryption, and buzzing something off to a satellite that's going to end up in Washington. That's their nightmare, and I think our principal advantage. So technology, digital technology in particular, is going to be democratizing. And I think it's ultimately going to be an advantage for U.S. intelligence rather than a detriment. It's going to make some things harder, but I think it's going to make learning our adversaries' plans and intentions and capabilities ultimately easier, because they're not going to be able to stop our sources from reporting to us.
All right, and just my colleagues, if you have any questions, pass out those question cards. We'll turn to those in a minute. Maybe one or two more quick questions. Just as something we discussed earlier, a lot of people maybe have concerns about it. Obviously, with the counterterrorism mission of the last 20 years, the CIA in particular, of the intelligence agencies, got much more involved in terms of military actions, whether it be UAVs and drones launching missiles, or involve the special operation raids themselves. Do you think at this stage more of that responsibility and that burden should be placed back on, say, just the traditional U.S. military, traditional U.S. special forces? Do you think maybe the CIA got over-militarized during this period?
Well, I wouldn't subscribe to the view that they were necessarily overly militarized. They were appropriately militarized, because the fight was going to take place on a paramilitary level, in underdeveloped parts of the world, and the CIA, in limited instances, had to be able to compete and fight in that space, and they have the people to do it. Now, what should they be doing going forward in this new environment where counterterrorism is less of a concern, and China and possibly a declining Russia are more of a concern? There are perfectly respectable, even smart, brilliant, experienced people on every side of this argument. I'm not one of them, but I do have a perspective on it. I would argue that if Ambassador Burns, the current CIA director, were asking me, how to handle this question, I believe CIA should be handing off many of these paramilitary roles, particularly those involving airframes technology, whether it's the armed UAV kinetic mission in South Asia, North Africa, Middle East, Persian Gulf. I believe a lot of this could be turned over safely with minimal loss of capacity to the U.S. military. We have tremendous military. They know how to fly UAVs. They know how to acquire targets. They know how to make discretionary decisions on who's dangerous and who's less dangerous. And that would free up our CIA to do what CIA was designed to do originally, and that's collect political intelligence from inside the governments of our adversaries, where I think they have a real strength. So I would argue that some of these more kinetic, more militarized missions, the CIA could safely transition to the U.S. Defense Department with little loss in capacity and great benefit in terms of freeing up officers, analysts, linguists, photo interpreters to do things that are more useful against the Chinese and other targets.
And just, especially in light of, I know a lot of students, whether they're high school students or college students watching at home, or anyone kind of maybe in the early 20s or 30s, who's, has, a deep interest in serving the country. It's an incredibly powerful and meaningful way in which you serve the nation. What would you say to any of those people thinking about a career, especially as a, on the operation side, as a case officer like yourself? What is there to think about? And I suppose I always think it's an incredibly intensive process to even be admitted to the CIA. You have to have someone with incredibly high, earnest values, extremely truthful in everything going through, but then they have to be able to have that character, but turn around and be somebody who can live a double life. How do you put those two together, and what would you say people might be interested in his career?
Okay, so that's an easy one. Thanks for serving it up. I have the pleasure to work every day at the University of Texas and lead an intelligence studies project, and I see some of the best young students and best kids that are produced in Texas and in this part of the world, and it's really greatly satisfying and encouraging to find so many of them want to serve. Right now, it's a little bit of self-selection. I teach at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, so these are graduate students who've already made a decision. They want to work for their government or their fellow citizens and make the world a better place in one way or another. But I see dozens, we see hundreds of students who come in and ask that very question. I think I'd like to serve. What's it like to serve in the government? What's it like to be a civil servant? I think I'd like to be involved in national security. Can you tell me about the military? Can you tell me about being a diplomat? Can you tell me about intelligence? Or some of them, 18-year-olds, and this is an interesting experience, 2 years on campus, or excuse me, 2 months on campus, right, just unpacked, still getting cookies from their mother, and they plop down in a chair in your office and say, I'm going to be a case officer from the CIA. Well, that's great. Let's unpack that a little bit. So study hard, get good grades, keep your nose clean. You're going to have to get a security clearance, pass a couple polygraphs, take the right courses, get some overseas experience, speak a hard foreign language, or at least show you know how to learn one. And then what I'm looking for, the secret sauce, it's not secret sauce, I'm not getting paid to recruit for anybody, but I do encourage youngsters to go off to Washington if they want to serve and try their hand at intelligence to compete for positions. Very difficult, as it should be, which is good for us, right? Good for the country. It's a buyer's market. They get to choose who comes through the front door, and they got a wide choice, and they got a lot of talent to choose from, and they got tens and tens of thousands of applicants for a very small number of jobs. So we should feel good that we're We're getting good, talented people, intelligence. But what I'm looking for most often is that genuine curiosity about things going on outside the United States, right? Every 18, 19-year-old, 20-year-old has an interest, whether it's their hometown or their football team or their girlfriend or their fraternity or their sorority. That's all great. That's irrelevant. The U.S. intelligence community has no legitimate interest, absent DHS and FBI in certain areas, in what's going on inside the United States. We've built a foreign intelligence apparatus to understand what's going on outside the United States and the rest of this big, complicated world. And I'm looking for people who want to live in that world, who prefer to live overseas, to understand foreign cultures, love learning new languages, love moving around every couple of years, don't mind taking some risks, and have a passion for that sort of thing. And we see some of them, and it's really rewarding when I say we don't recruit for anybody, we don't. But we talk about what we did and how satisfying and rewarding it was for all of us, and some of them take that on board and say, that sounds like something I'd like to do. And we're really happy when we get a cryptic message from one of our students that tells us they're doing real well, have a job in Washington. I'm an analyst with a government agency. I say, well, that's great. And we don't ask any more questions because none of us is clear and it's not our business. So hopefully they have as much fun and success as me and my friends did.
And just related to the career itself, Michael asked an interesting question. How often do CIA case officers deteriorate mentally due to the stress and the strain to the point where they might need support from CIA's psychological services?
Yeah, no, I thought that was a personal attack for a while there. No, but it's actually a very serious topic. And so my understanding of it is much better today than 10 years ago or 20 years ago. I think that, of course, pioneered by the U.S. military, who has a tremendous appreciation for the emotional and psychological and other harms that soldiers, sailors, and airmen and Marines suffer downrange. It happens in the U.S. intelligence community too, particularly people that are out at forward operating bases in undeveloped countries and experience some of the same stresses that the U.S. military, uniformed military people do. The CIA has a fleet of psychiatrists. They have a strong Office of Medical Services. They're very attuned to the emotional and psychological stresses that people in the field are under and the treatments that people need when they come home. They're also heavily involved in the selection of people to go to places where they're going to be able to succeed, right? There's some screening and some testing that allows them to make an informed judgment. This person's going to prosper in Moscow under 24-hour surveillance with cameras and microphones in their apartment. Not everybody wants to live that way, particularly not your spouse and your children and others who didn't sign up, right? So there's a lot of psychological testing to go to a place like that or to go to a dangerous place. And we have family issues. I say we. I haven't worked at CIA in 7 years, but I have a hard time getting rid of the pronoun. U.S. intelligence recognizes the tremendous strains that they place on families, particularly with unaccompanied assignments to war zones, which are increasingly common. Hopefully they won't be so common in the future, but places that are dangerous, you don't get to bring your family, your wife and kids, or your husband and kids, and that creates a lot of stresses in its own right. And so my experience with the CIA is they're very serious about addressing the psychological and sometimes psychiatric needs of their workforce.
Okay. And two good questions, obviously, from we discussed the not unexpected but incredibly rapid fall of the Afghan government. One question asks, can you give your viewpoint on the reasons for the failures and misjudgments in the assessment of the strength of the government? And Linda asks, why did the intelligence community foresee the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan in such lightning speed?
Yeah, it's a great question. I honestly don't know. I would just argue and caution that leaping to intelligence failure as quickly as the U.S. media and the commentary like to do is not the right answer, because none of us knew several weeks ago when this was being debated, or even today. Does anybody here know what the U.S. intelligence community said to the president or to the military commanders or General McKinsey? I don't. And so before we declare that they failed to adequately warn, we should probably let somebody look at what they actually said, when they said it, and how close to accurate was it, right? So it may be that the intelligence wasn't as clear as it might have been, or wasn't as urgent, or maybe the timelines that the intelligence analysts drew were not as abrupt. I wouldn't be surprised to learn that was the case, but people are looking at it. And on the broader picture of the withdrawal, it seems to me it was always going to be messy. It's the most dangerous, untidy period of any military operation, is leaving the theater safely. It certainly could have been executed a lot more competently, but the die was cast years earlier when we reached the agreement with the Taliban that we were leaving by date certain. At that point, they had prevailed. They were going to eventually rule the country. And people who think the Taliban was going to sit at the city ring road and wait and not come in and claim their prize, that 2,000 U.S. forces were going to keep them from taking over the central government in Kabul, I think are deluding themselves. It was going to happen, and there were actually, if you may have read David Ignatius' column and some others in the Post, U.S. intelligence apparently, full story is not known, but did some very remarkable things in the weeks as the troops are being withdrawn to remove literally thousands of people who had risked their lives and their families' lives to help U.S. intelligence, were exfiltrated from and are now in safe places. So that's a remarkable tribute to the commitment that the CIA and our intelligence agencies make to people who help us in environments like this. I think they were all protected, I understand.
And just for sake of time, just maybe two last questions and maybe an interesting way to close it out. But very quickly, Hazel Shast, can you explain why there are 18 different agencies?
That's a darn good question. History, right? It starts in 1947 when President Harry Truman signs the National Security Act and he creates the CIA. That means at that point we've got naval intelligence, we've got Army intelligence, we've got the FBI, we've got the CIA, so we had four in the 1940s, and we gradually grew. We discovered we were going to put satellites in the sky to collect intelligence, so we created agencies to build the satellites, agencies to interpret the data from the satellites. We decided that intercepting communications was a really important source of information, and that the Army and the Navy didn't want to do it anymore, so we created the National Security Agency in the 1950s. So every new agency had a reason for being created, but it's created quite a management challenge in 2021, with now 18, the most recent being the Space Force has its own intelligence organization somewhere doing something to support their mission. And so the DNI has a huge challenge. This is why I supported then and support now having a strong central leader, because you can imagine 18 agencies scattered around at least 6 different cabinet departments, working for different cabinet secretaries, providing local support. You know, it's hard to get them all to pull in one direction. And as we discussed earlier, that direction is now China. And Director Haynes is probably going to spend her tenure as DNI trying to get these 18 agencies to stop doing what they want to do, or what their cabinet secretary wants to do, but what the national intelligence enterprise needs them to do. That'll be worth watching.
And lastly, these questions I'll just put together for the sake of time, but also thematically all related. Obviously, they're more in the purview of the FBI and issues related to within the United States. It's not where CIA and other agencies should be working. But just to one person has asked, do you have anything? Do you have any concerns, I suppose, about domestic terrorism? Someone else related to that asked. I know it's not within the purview of the CIA, but are we shifting resources to deal with this domestic terrorism? And then I suppose with regards to how you combat it, and if you go too far, someone else asks, and how concerned are you about the use of national intelligence capabilities being leveraged against U.S. citizens that hold conservative or could be any left-leaning views to the point of in politics?
To answer that last question, I think if FBI Director Wray is correct in his assessments, and he's likely the best informed intelligence leader on this topic, on domestic extremism and the likelihood for violence in the future. I think we are going to need to use our national intelligence resources, including the lessons and the capabilities we developed in the war on terrorism overseas in this country, but I don't think it has anything to do with left and right and conservative and progressive. It has to do with law-abiding and people interested in conducting violence that violates the law, right? I don't think we're going to have our CIA working in the United States. That was a lesson proven in the 1970s with the Church and Pike committees, that our country didn't want our foreign intelligence service working within our own borders. But we have agencies who have that as part of the mission. And I point to the FBI centrally. Director Wray's been very vocal about this, even when it wasn't very pleasing to the White House. He took great risk to sound an alarm on the rise of domestic terrorism. He was regrettably proven right on January 6th and in things that have been detected since then. So I think it is an emerging problem. It's going to be serious, and we're going to need the full force of our U.S. intelligence capabilities, even in the United States, where we recognize that citizens have privacy and civil liberties rights. And that will be an extreme challenge for directors of national intelligence, is to design a way to collect the information we need to detect and disrupt acts of domestic terrorism while respecting the civil liberties of folks who are not breaking the law. That's going to be a difficult needle to thread, but I think, regrettably, it's in our future.
And in particular, as domestic issues are already here and perhaps become more of an issue, just in closing, could you talk about kind of what you hope for from the intelligence community and maybe for the American public to understand, and maybe the need for greater transparency as much as is possible, at least, greater kind of sharing with the public of what is actually being done, how it's being done, the reason. You give maybe some closing remarks in terms of what you think overall the U.S. intelligence community should be doing so that the American public understands what it is doing and that it's being regulated and overseen adequately.
So, yes. I do think the U.S. intelligence community has to be more transparent. We should all recognize, of course, the tension that we're dealing with here. We're talking about secret intelligence organizations that must hold closely the information about who they're dealing with, how they're dealing with them, how they go about their work, right? So intelligence work must be secret to be successful. However, our open, consensual form of government allows power to flow from the people to the elected representatives, and then the people every 2 years get to decide whether they like how the government is governing, and they get to replace their government if they want to. But how can the people make that choice if they don't know what their government's doing? This is the fundamental dilemma of secret intelligence in an open democratic society, and there's no right answer. There's constant tension, but I would argue that the intelligence leadership going forward should err on the side of openness and transparency. We make too many secrets. We don't declassify enough old secrets. We don't answer enough questions, we the intelligence community, in public. And you all are entitled to know. And regrettably, one of the reasons for that is because our elected representatives have proven themselves incapable very frequently in conducting democratic oversight of U.S. intelligence. They fracture on party lines, they squabble with one another, and if they don't work consensually in a nonpartisan way, they're useless. Right? Half the population won't believe whatever they decide and recommend. So the Congress has not been a strong democratic overseer of U.S. intelligence in recent years. I think the people should be entitled to know more and make their own judgments, and therefore I support wholeheartedly the transparency initiative that Director Jim Clapper launched several years ago when he was the Director of National Intelligence for exactly this reason. He said the American people need to know more about us, what we do, who we are, how we are concerned with their privacy and civil liberties. And I'll just close by saying that, again, a plug for the University of Texas, that our Intelligence Studies Project, one of the first projects I started that we've now done for 6 years running, is an annual national poll by YouGov that asks people, American public, what they know and how they feel about their U.S. intelligence. whether they support them, whether they think they're law-abiding, whether they think they're effective, whether they think they could share more secrets without compromising our national security. And the short answers are these, and they're consistent across all 6 years we've done it so far. The American people have strong support and confidence in the intelligence community. More than 60% think we've got a highly capable intelligence community that helps us stay secure. That's really important. The thing they think our intelligence community is best at, more than 80%, think we're pretty good at counterterrorism. Finding and dealing with terrorists. Well, 20 years without a second attack will get you some credit from the American people. What do the American people think our U.S. intelligence community is least capable of, least competent with? Protecting your privacy and civil liberties. They think the USIC doesn't care. Only 40% think the IC cares about your privacy. So, and this is Edward Snowden, NSA, and lots of residue. That's unfortunate, and a darn good thing for the Director of National Intelligence to start working on, because the American people also think, by an overwhelming margin, that the U.S. intelligence community keeps too much secret and should be sharing a lot more with them. They'd like to pass judgment on the kind of job they're doing, and I agree. Right? It requires a lot of work, when you're busy on mission and you're trying to stop terrorist attacks, to spend an afternoon declassifying information so historians can write about it, people can give speeches about it, books can be written about it. But I think it's important to our form of government. And ultimately, an institution in a democracy that doesn't enjoy the approval, the consent, sufferance at least, of the American people is not going to last long. Next crisis, they're going to make you go away. Right? If you don't have some basis of popular support, that's just fundamental democracy. So I'd argue that's a good project for the DNI. She's said in her confirmation hearings that she believes in transparency and is going to make more information public, and we should hold her to that.
All right, well, again, I want to thank all of you for coming here this evening, and all of you watching at home, and you all please join me in thanking Stephen Smith, not just for tonight, but mostly for decades of federal service in some rough parts of the world, service to our nation, and some difficult and stressful job. And thank you for all that you've done. Thank you.